They said Eleanor and James Morrison were foolish. At 72 and 74, with $843.17 to their name and 72 hours before being separated forever, they accepted an inheritance, everyone called worthless, a crumbling Victorian mansion in Maine that no one had entered in 47 years. What their 3 children who hadn't called in 31 months didn't know was that behind a locked door on the 3rd floor sat $245 million worth of art that would change everything. But first, the Morrisons had to survive 3 days in a house with no heat, no water, and secrets that someone very close to them would kill to keep hidden. The fluorescent lights in the Wells Fargo branch buzzed overhead like dying insects. Eleanor Morrison sat in the hard plastic chair, her hand wrapped around her husband's, trying not to cry. The clock on the wall read 2:47 in the afternoon. Tuesday, August 15, 2023. A date that would divide their lives into before and after, though they didn't know it yet. The bank officer, young, maybe 30, with a name tag that read Ashley, slid a paper across the desk. Her expression carried that particular mix of pity and discomfort that people wear when witnessing someone else's catastrophe. The paper had numbers, final numbers. Account balance $843.17. Below that, stamped in red, Final foreclosure notice. Eviction proceedings to commence August 18, 2023. Property must be vacated within 72 hours. 72 hours. 3 days. And then what remained of their lives would fit into a 1998 Honda Accord with 230,000 miles on it parked outside in the August heat. Jim's jaw worked silently. His hands, the same hands that had maintained Boeing aircraft for 34 years, that had built their children's treehouse, that had held Eleanor through 45 years of marriage before the cancer, before the debt, before everything fell apart. Those hands trembled slightly as he picked up the paper. Eleanor knew what he was thinking because after 52 years of marriage they could read each other's silences. He was calculating, always calculating. The engineer's mind that never stopped trying to solve problems, even when the mathematics were brutal and unyielding. $843.17, the sum total of a life spent doing everything right. Teaching elementary school for 35 years, never missing a mortgage payment until the medical bills came, never asking for handouts, never complaining, just working. Saving, building a future that was supposed to include grandchildren visiting on weekends and quiet retirement dinners at that little Italian place on Hawthorne. Instead, they had 72 hours and a choice between 2 nursing homes on opposite sides of Portland. Separate facilities, the only beds available in their price range, which is to say the only beds they could access through Medicaid after burning through every dollar they'd saved. Riverside Care for Jim, North Portland. The brochure had shown a cheerful common room with elderly residents playing checkers. Nobody in the brochure looked like they'd rather be dead. Sunset Manor for Eleanor. Beaverton, 18 miles away. Close enough to be in the same city, far enough that visiting would require transportation. Neither of them had money, neither of them possessed. After 52 years of sleeping in the same bed, of breathing in sync in the dark, of that particular intimacy that comes from decades of shared silence, they would die apart. Alone. In rooms that smelled of disinfectant and institutional despair. Eleanor felt the tears coming and forced them down. Crying wouldn't change the mathematics. Crying wouldn't add zeros to their account balance or reverse the foreclosure on 1334 Maple Drive. The house where they'd raised 3 children hosted 52 Thanksgiving dinners, celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, and the ordinary miracle of being together. The house that was no longer theirs. Ashley cleared her throat softly. Compassionate but firm, the way people are when they've delivered bad news before and learned to protect themselves from the weight of other people's grief. Eleanor stood first. Dignity mattered. Even now, especially now, dignity mattered. She squeezed Jim's hand. Their private signal developed over 5 decades that meant, "I love you, and we'll survive this, and I'm here," and they walked out of the Wells Fargo into the brutal sunshine of a Portland afternoon. The Honda waited in the parking lot, faded blue paint. Passenger door slightly dented from when Eleanor had misjudged the garage wall 3 years ago. Back seats scattered with the detritus of their current reality, sleeping bags, a cooler plastic grocery bags containing their remaining clothes. They'd been living in the car for 2 weeks, ever since the eviction from their apartment, the apartment they'd moved into after losing the house. The apartment whose rent had climbed beyond their fixed income, the apartment where the landlord had finally run out of patience with their promises of soon, of next week, of we're waiting on some money. There was no money coming. There had never been money coming. Just hope, which turned out to be worth exactly nothing when measured against late fees and final notices. Jim opened the driver's door and paused, staring at something on the windshield. A parking ticket. $25 for exceeding the 2-hour limit. $25 they didn't have for a violation committed while learning they had 72 hours before losing each other forever. He pulled the ticket from under the wiper blade, read it once, and then in a gesture so uncharacteristic it made Eleanor's chest ache, crumpled it and dropped it on the ground. Jim Morrison, who had never littered in his life, who taught their children to pick up trash at parks, who believed in rules and order and doing the right thing, just dropped a crumpled ticket on the asphalt and got in the car. Eleanor slid into the passenger seat. The vinyl burned against her legs. The air inside tasted stale and hot and faintly of the fast food they'd been eating because it was cheap and you could get full on $3 if you ordered carefully. Jim didn't start the engine. Starting the engine meant using gas, and gas cost money, and money was a finite resource measured in dollars and cents down to the exact penny. They sat in the heat, waiting for something. Neither knew what. Eleanor's phone buzzed in her purse. An email notification. She pulled it out, the screen cracked from a drop 6 months ago that they couldn't afford to repair. The email subject line read, "Medical collections. Final notice before legal action. $127,000. The number that had destroyed everything. The number that started with Jim's diagnosis. 2.5 years ago, pancreatic cancer, stage 2, 20% survival rate, and had grown with each treatment, each surgery, each medication that insurance deemed not medically necessary, despite the oncologist's insistence that it was necessary if Jim wanted to live. He'd lived. Against odds that should have killed him, James Morrison had beaten pancreatic cancer. 8 months in remission. Clean scans. The doctors called him lucky. Lucky. With $127,000 in medical debt and 72 hours before permanent separation. The breakdown was simple, brutal math that Eleanor had memorized like a prayer. She couldn't stop reciting. $42,000 for the surgery that removed part of Jim's pancreas. $38,000 for 8 rounds of chemotherapy. $9,000 for radiation that burned his skin and stole his strength. Together, $89,000. Insurance had covered $31,000, leaving $58,000 that had to come from somewhere. Somewhere had been their savings account. $67,433 on March 1, 2021. The accumulation of 3.5 decades of careful planning. Gone by October. Then Eleanor's heart had failed. June 3, 2021. Emergency valve replacement while Jim was still weak from chemo. $38,000. Insurance covered $14,000. Combined medical debt $127,000. Retirement accounts drained. Second mortgage couldn't make payments. Credit cards maxed at $23,000 trying to cover the gap. The house had gone first. Foreclosure in November 2022 after 37 months of failed promises and payment plans that they couldn't maintain on Social Security. $2,340 a month from the government. After the payment plan on the medical debt, $350 monthly, they had $1,990 to cover everything else. It hadn't been enough. It would never be enough. They'd lost the house, then the apartment. Now they were losing each other. Eleanor looked at her husband. Really looked at him. 74 years old, shoulders that had been broad in their 20s now slightly stooped, hair white instead of the dark brown she'd fallen in love with in 1971. Hands marked with age spots and small scars from a lifetime of fixing things. Beautiful. Still beautiful to her after 52 years. His eyes met hers, blue-gray, the color of the ocean on overcast days. Steady. Even now steady. The heat in the car became unbearable. Jim started the engine. The gauge showed a quarter tank, maybe 60 miles left before they'd need to find money for gas. They drove without destination. Portland, sliding past the windows, the library where Eleanor had worked part-time for 12 years, Rosa Parks Elementary where she'd taught second grade for 35 years, the high school where Jim had coached their son's Little League team back when they'd had energy for things beyond survival. Past 1334 Maple Drive. Their house. Except it wasn't their house anymore. Someone else's furniture visible through the front windows. Someone else's car in the driveway. Someone else's life happening in the rooms where they'd built theirs. Eleanor turned away, looking hurt too much. Jim drove until they reached the edges of the city where strip malls gave way to scattered houses and the pretense of urban civilization thinned into something more honest. He pulled into a rest stop, cut the engine. They had decisions to make, nursing homes to call, arrangements to finalize. The administrative details of dissolution that bureaucracy demanded even from people with $843.17. Instead, they sat in silence. The kind of silence that comes from knowing everything that needs to be said and having already said it 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. Eleanor's thoughts drifted backward, pulled by the gravity of memory toward easier times. Not easier exactly, just different, when problems had solutions and effort mattered, and the future stretched ahead instead of collapsing inward. 1971. She'd been 20 years old, a junior at Portland State studying elementary education. Jim had been 22, finishing his engineering degree. They'd met at a campus coffee shop where she worked weekends to pay tuition. He'd ordered black coffee and asked her name, and she'd known the way you sometimes know things without evidence or reason that this quiet, serious boy with the careful hands and steady eyes would matter. They'd married that October. A small wedding because they were young and broke and impatient to start the life they could see so clearly ahead of them. Her parents had attended, uncertain but supportive. His parents had been there too, plus his great-aunt Vivian, who'd traveled from Maine. An elderly woman, even then severe and elegant, who'd given them a check for $500 and a card that read, "Build something beautiful." They had. For 52 years they had built something beautiful. 3 children. Garrett, born 1975. Patricia, 1977. Benjamin, 1981. Raised in that house on Maple Drive. Fed at the table Jim had refinished himself, tucked into beds that Eleanor had made up with thrift store sheets, washed soft through years of use. Sunday pancakes at the original Pancake House. A tradition since 1973. The same booth when they could get it, the same orders: blueberry for Garrett, chocolate chip for Patricia, plain with butter for Ben. Jim always ordered the Dutch baby, Eleanor the Swedish pancakes. The kids would fight over who got the window seat until they got old enough to be embarrassed by caring. Little League in the 80s, Jim coaching because he was good with kids, patient in a way that made them want to please him. Garrett had played first base with the intensity he brought to everything. Serious even at 8 years old, already calculating angles and odds. Piano recitals for Patricia. Eleanor had sewn the recital dresses because buying them new was wasteful when she had a machine and fabric could be found on sale. Pink tulle for the spring concert in 1985. Patricia had been 8. Nervous, had forgotten the second movement of her Mozart sonata and improvised something that sounded close enough that only the teacher knew. Science fairs with Ben. The quiet one, the dreamy one who wanted to be a teacher like his mother. They'd helped him with every project: the volcano in 4th grade, the solar system model in 6th, the surprisingly sophisticated analysis of water quality in local streams for his 8th grade project that had won 2nd place at districts. The photos were still in albums somewhere, Polaroids and the kind of film prints that had defined their generation. Images fading to yellows and sepias, physical proof that this life had happened, that they had been young once, that their children had been small and needed them. PTA meetings. Eleanor had never missed one in 35 years of teaching. She'd organized book fairs and fundraisers and the Teacher Appreciation Week events, volunteered for field trip chaperone duty, knew every student's name by October and their siblings' names by November, and which families needed extra support delivered quietly through donations to the Classroom Supply Fund. Jim at Boeing, 34 years maintaining aircraft that carried hundreds of people safely through the sky. Starting at 22 as a junior engineer, promoted to senior maintenance supervisor by 30, keeping the same position because it paid well and was steady and had benefits. Health insurance that seemed generous until it met catastrophic illness and revealed its limitations. One job for 34 years, one marriage for 52 years, one house for 41 years. The kind of loyalty and commitment their generation had been taught to value. The kind of stability that was supposed to matter. It had mattered, until it hadn't. Until medical bills and foreclosure and the arithmetic of poverty had rendered all that loyalty meaningless. The shift had come gradually, the children growing up, moving away. Natural, expected. Garrett to Columbia Law School, brilliant and ambitious, and already calculating the path to the partnership he'd eventually make at a Manhattan firm. Patricia to Seattle, married to Marcus Caldwell, a quiet accountant who seemed kind in the brief moments they'd spent with him at the wedding. Ben to teaching, staying in Portland, scraping by on a public school salary that Eleanor understood intimately. Calls had become less frequent through the 90s, weekly to monthly to holidays and birthdays. Visits stretched from every month to a few times a year to eventually just Thanksgiving and Christmas if schedules allowed. If schedules allowed. That phrase that had started meaning so much. Eleanor had noticed but hadn't worried. Children grew up, built their own lives. That was natural, healthy even. She and Jim had each other. That was enough. Then January 14th, 2021, the morning of Jim's surgery. The pancreatic cancer that had appeared on scans like a death sentence, stage 2, aggressive 20% survival rate even with intervention. Eleanor had called Garrett from the hospital waiting room. 6 in the morning, Portland time, 9 in New York. She'd waited until a reasonable hour, didn't want to wake him even though her hands had been shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. His assistant had answered. Professional, polite. Mr. Morrison was in a deposition. Could she take a message? She'd left one. Dad's going into surgery. Pancreatic cancer. They're removing part of his pancreas. If you can call back. Garrett had texted 3 hours later while Jim was still in recovery, in meetings all day. I'll send flowers. The flowers had arrived the next morning. $50 from FTD. Bright, cheerful, entirely impersonal. The card had read, "Get well soon." G, not Dad, not love, just G. He'd never called to ask about the prognosis, never asked how the surgery had gone, never asked if there was anything he could do. 5 months later, June 3, 2021, Eleanor's heart had given out. Sudden catastrophic valve failure. The ER doctor had used words like critical and emergency, and she'd been conscious just long enough to see Jim's face go white with terror before they'd sedated her for the surgery that would save her life and cost $38,000 they didn't have. Jim had texted all 3 children from the ICU waiting room, "Mom in ICU. Critical. Heart valve replacement surgery happening now." Patricia had responded 6 hours later. "Hope you're okay. Busy with work." 8 words. No call. No follow-up. Just 8 words sent during some break in her busy day to acknowledge that her mother was possibly dying. Garrett hadn't responded at all. Ben had called. Immediately. Crying on the phone, asking if he should come if Dad needed anything, voice breaking with worry. But when Jim had said yes, please come, Ben had hesitated, shifted, made excuses about not being able to get time off work. It was Saturday. The excuse was transparent, painful. He'd sent $500 2 days later, money Eleanor knew he didn't have, pulled from somewhere Ben couldn't afford, and a card that said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, I should be there. Should be there." But wasn't. November 18th, 2022. The final foreclosure notice arriving on what had been their house, after months of failed payment plans and promises they couldn't keep, and the grinding knowledge that they were losing everything they'd built. Eleanor had written 3 separate emails, one to each child. Careful emails. Not asking for money directly, just explaining the medical bills, the lost savings, the house, the desperate situation, hoping they would understand, hoping someone would help. Garrett's response had arrived 4 days later. "Sorry to hear about your situation. Unfortunately, Amanda and I are stretched thin with the kids' private school tuition. Can't help financially. Have you looked into reverse mortgages?" They'd already lost the house. His email had come 4 days after the one explaining that. Either he hadn't read carefully or hadn't cared enough to read carefully. The distinction didn't matter. Patricia hadn't responded at all. Ben had called, cried again, sent the $500 again, all he could afford, and cried some more because it wasn't enough, and he knew it, and the helplessness in his voice had hurt more than the abandonment from his siblings, because at least Ben felt something. March 2nd, 2023. Eleanor's 72nd birthday. She'd maintained the tradition of sending birthday cards to her children, handwritten cards purchased from the dollar store because Hallmark cost too much now. Simple messages. "I love you. I'm proud of you. I hope you're well." Garrett's card had come back 2 weeks later. Return to sender. Not at this address stamped across the envelope. He'd moved. Upgraded, she'd discovered later through a Google search she was ashamed to have conducted. From a nice apartment in Manhattan to a penthouse in Tribeca. $3 million according to the real estate listing she'd found. And he hadn't sent his parents his new address. Hadn't called to tell them he was moving. Hadn't called to say happy birthday, Mom. Hadn't called at all. August 8, 2023. 1 week ago. Jim had tried calling Patricia. They'd needed help coordinating the move from the apartment to somewhere, anywhere. The logistics of homelessness requiring contact information they no longer had. Patricia's number had been disconnected. Entirely. No forwarding message, no new number, just the automated voice saying the number was no longer in service. Jim had found her on Facebook, his first time using the platform, fumbling through the interface with the bewildered patience he brought to all technology. He'd sent a message, "Trish, we need to talk. Please call." The message had shown as read at 2:34 p.m. The read receipt sitting there, proving she'd seen it, proving she'd chosen not to respond. Then nothing. And the next day when he'd tried to send another message, he'd discovered she'd blocked him. Blocked her own father. After 50 years of being his daughter, after every piano recital and birthday party and Christmas morning, she'd pressed a button that said block and erased them from her digital life. 31 months of near total silence from Garrett and Patricia. 31 months of only Ben reaching out, and even that was sporadic, apologetic, always followed by explanations about why he couldn't do more, couldn't visit, couldn't help beyond the occasional guilty check that both of them knew he couldn't afford to send. Eleanor pulled herself back to the present. The Honda's interior had become an oven. Sweat ran down her back. Her heart, the repaired heart that had cost $38,000, beat steadily in her chest. Jim's phone rang, the sound jarring in the silence. He answered, listened, said very little. His face gave nothing away, but Eleanor knew. After 52 years, she knew. He ended the call, set the phone down carefully on the dashboard. The nursing homes had confirmed. Beds available starting August 18th. 72 hours from now. Riverside Care for him, Sunset Manor for her. 18 miles apart. The paperwork would be ready to sign tomorrow. Eleanor waited for him to say something. When he didn't, she spoke instead. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. They sat with that truth, the finality of it. After 52 years of marriage, of sleeping side by side, of being the constant in each other's lives through job changes and raising children and her father's death and his mother's stroke and every mundane crisis and ordinary joy, they would die alone, in separate rooms, tended by strangers who would be kind but couldn't possibly understand what it meant to lose the person who'd been your whole world for more than half a century. Jim started the engine again, drove them back toward the city. The sun was setting, painting Portland in the golden light that made everything look beautiful and temporary. They needed groceries, needed gas, needed a place to park overnight where police wouldn't knock on the window at 2 a.m. and tell them to move along, needed to figure out how to stretch $843.17 across the next 72 hours. Jim pulled into a shopping center, parked near the back where the Honda wouldn't be obvious among the employee vehicles. Cut the engine. Eleanor saw it first. The envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. White, official looking. Certified mail receipt attached. Probably another collection notice. Another final warning. Another piece of paper documenting their failure. Jim got out, retrieved it. Stood reading the return address in the fading light. His expression changed. Something Eleanor couldn't quite read. He got back in the car. Handed her the envelope. The return address read, Pemberton and Associates Attorneys at Law, Bar Harbor, Maine. Maine. Eleanor turned the envelope over. Certified mail. Sent to their old address on Maple Drive, forwarded to the apartment, forwarded again to general delivery at their P.O. box, the final bureaucratic tether they maintained, because even homeless people needed a mailing address. She opened it carefully. Inside a formal letter on heavy cream stationery. R.E., Estate of Vivian Whitmore Morrison, deceased. Eleanor's breath caught. Vivian. Great-Aunt Vivian. Jim's father's aunt. The severe, elegant woman who'd come to their wedding 52 years ago and then to Jim's father's funeral in 1987. The eccentric relative the family had lost touch with decades ago. Eleanor read aloud, her voice catching on certain phrases. Dear Mr. Morrison, it is my duty to inform you of the death of your great-aunt Vivian Whitmore Morrison, who passed away on April 3, 2023 at the age of 99. The probate of her estate has been completed, and I am writing to notify you that you have been named the sole heir in her last will and testament. As the only surviving blood relative, you inherit the following: The property located at 47 Lighthouse Road, Cold Harbor, Maine, including all structures and contents therein. Property taxes have been paid current through December 31, 2023. Please note that under Maine law you must claim this inheritance within 90 days of notification or the property will escheat to the state. This letter serves as official notification. The deadline for claiming the inheritance is October 15, 2023. Should you wish to accept this bequest, please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of deed and keys. Sincerely, Thomas Pemberton, Esquire. Silence filled the car, the kind of silence that precedes either hope or heartbreak, and neither of them could tell which. 47 Lighthouse Road, Cold Harbor, Maine. Eleanor had never heard of it, had never been to Maine, had met Vivian exactly twice in 52 years, once at their wedding, once at a funeral. Brief encounters, polite conversation, the distant kindness of an elderly relative who lived too far away for regular contact. And now Vivian was dead, had been dead for 4 months, had left them property in a place called Cold Harbor, population unknown, significance unclear. Jim pulled out his phone. The battery was at 15%. They'd need to find somewhere to charge it soon, but first he needed to know what this meant. He typed Cold Harbor, Maine. Google Maps loaded slowly on the weak signal. Population 347. A fishing village on the Maine coast. Remote, rural. The kind of place that existed in the cracks between tourist destinations and actual cities. He switched to Google Street View, typed in the address, waited while satellite data assembled itself into images captured by someone driving past years ago. 47 Lighthouse Road appeared on screen. A Victorian mansion. 3 stories. Weathered paint that might have been navy blue once but had faded to a ghostly gray. Shuttered windows, overgrown yard, wild roses and what looked like poison ivy covering most of the first floor. A sign visible through the vegetation. Private property. No trespassing. Morrison Estate. The image was dated August 2015, 8 years ago. No telling what condition the place was in now. Eleanor leaned over to see. The house was enormous. 6,000 square feet according to the property records Jim pulled up next. 4 acres. Last sale recorded in 1952 for $8,000. They sat in the Honda staring at the phone screen trying to understand what this meant. An inheritance. Property. In Maine. 3,000 miles from Portland. From the nursing homes they were supposed to check into in 72 hours. But what kind of property? The street view showed a structure that looked one strong wind away from collapse. Forums discussing Cold Harbor mentioned the old Morrison place as an eyesore, abandoned for decades, probably condemned. Worthless. Probably worthless. But it was something. After months of nothing, after the grinding descent into poverty that had stripped away everything they'd built here, was something. Eleanor's mind, shaped by 35 years of teaching second graders to think critically and solve problems, began working through the logistics. They had $843.17. Maine was 3,000 miles away. Flying would cost, she did quick mental math, maybe $600 for 2 tickets if they could find the cheapest possible flights. But then they'd need transportation from the airport. Food. A way back. They didn't have enough. Even if the inheritance was real, even if the property had value, they couldn't afford to get there to claim it. Jim was doing his own calculations. The engineer's mind processing variables and constraints. His voice came out quiet, factual. Flights Portland to Boston, cheapest fare available, $680 for 2. Greyhound Boston to Bar Harbor, $90 for 2. Taxi from Bar Harbor to Cold Harbor, he checked the distance, 23 miles, probably $60. That's $830 total. They had $843.17. $13.17 left for food contingencies, the return trip they hadn't budgeted for. Impossible. The mathematics were impossible. Eleanor looked at her husband. At the man who'd beaten cancer against 20% odds, who'd worked 34 years without complaint, who'd never given up on anything in his life until circumstances gave him no choice. She thought about Vivian, the severe, elegant woman at their wedding, the card that had said, "Build something beautiful," $500 that had helped pay for their honeymoon to the Oregon coast, a weekend in a cheap motel that had felt like luxury because they were 20 and 22 and together. Vivian had given them a chance once. Maybe she was giving them another. Or maybe this was just cruel timing. A final joke. Property they couldn't reach, wealth they couldn't access, hope they couldn't afford. Jim made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. The sound of someone who's reached the edge of endurance and found nothing but air. But Eleanor felt something different stirring, something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope, exactly. Something harder, something that tasted like defiance. They had 72 hours before being separated forever. 72 hours before dying alone in institutions that smelled of industrial cleanser and despair. 72 hours before everything ended, or they could gamble. Could spend their last $843.17 on a one-way trip to Maine to claim an inheritance that was probably worthless. Could bet everything on the memory of an elderly woman they'd met twice who'd left them something for reasons they'd never understand. The smart choice was obvious. Accept the nursing homes. Sign the papers. Let the state take Vivian's property. Survive. Eleanor had spent 72 years making smart choices, playing it safe, doing what she was supposed to do, following the rules. Look where that had gotten them. She turned to Jim, found him already looking at her, those blue-gray eyes that had steadied her through 52 years of marriage, that had promised her forever when they were too young to know what forever cost. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. Jim's hand found hers in the space between their seats, his wedding ring. The simple gold band they'd bought for $40 in 1971 caught the last of the evening light. The words that came next would change everything, or destroy everything. After 52 years, Eleanor Morrison no longer cared about the difference. The decision felt less like courage and more like surrender. Not to defeat, but to the possibility that dying while trying was better than dying while waiting. Jim sold his truck Wednesday morning to a man who paid cash and didn't ask questions. $1,200 for a vehicle that needed a transmission but still ran. Eleanor sold her jewelry at a pawn shop downtown, everything except her wedding ring. $340 for the gold necklace Jim had given her for their 25th anniversary, the silver bracelet from their children's high school graduations, the small diamond earrings she'd inherited from her mother. The pawnbroker had weighed each piece with clinical detachment, offered 70% of scrap value, and Eleanor had taken it without negotiating because negotiation required leverage they didn't possess. Total $2,383.17. Enough for one-way tickets on the red-eye to Boston Greyhound buses north, a taxi to Cold Harbor, and maybe 3 meals if they chose carefully. No money for hotels, no plan for getting home. Just faith that a woman they'd met twice had left them something worth more than the cost of reaching it. They donated their furniture to Goodwill Wednesday at 4 a.m. The couch that had survived 3 children and 30 years. The kitchen table where they'd eaten thousands of meals. The bed they'd shared for 5 decades. Workers loaded everything onto trucks while Eleanor and Jim watched from the Honda, and when the last piece disappeared, the apartment was just empty rooms that had briefly contained their lives. Jim's phone showed one unread email. He deleted it without opening it. More collections, more threats, more numbers documenting debt they'd never pay. None of it mattered anymore. The airport shuttle picked them up at 6 p.m. Jim carried both their bags, one duffel containing clothes, toiletries, the photo albums Eleanor refused to leave behind. Everything they owned that still mattered fit in 30 pounds. Security at PDX took 11 minutes. Eleanor's shoes triggered the metal detector steel arch supports her doctor had prescribed for plantar fasciitis 15 years ago. The TSA agent, young enough to be their granddaughter, patted her down with professional boredom. Jim's carry-on got flagged for the canned soup they'd packed confiscated because liquids over 3 ounces violated regulations written by people who'd never had to choose between hunger and compliance. Gate B7. Departure. 11:45 p.m. Red-eye to Boston, connecting through Denver. 6 hours of travel compressed into seats designed for people smaller and younger with knees that still bent easily and backs that didn't ache from sleeping in cars. Eleanor watched families at the gate, parents with small children, the kids already whining about being tired, a businessman in a suit too expensive to wrinkle typing on a laptop, college students with backpacks covered in patches, people living lives where flying was routine, where 3,000 miles was an inconvenience instead of an impossibility. Nobody looked at the elderly couple in worn clothes carrying one bag. Invisibility was poverty's most reliable feature. Boarding started at 11:15. Zone 4. Eleanor and Jim shuffled down the jetway with dozens of others, found seats 27E and 27F, middle and window, the cheapest available. A woman in 27D glanced at them, then immediately returned to her phone. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Just the universal agreement that airplane etiquette meant pretending everyone else didn't exist. The plane pushed back at 11:48. Eleanor gripped Jim's hand during takeoff the way she'd done on every flight they'd ever taken together. Irrational fear of physics that Jim had never mocked, just quietly accepted as one of the thousand small ways they'd learned to accommodate each other's vulnerabilities. Portland disappeared below them. City lights becoming a grid, becoming stars, becoming nothing as clouds obscured everything familiar. Sleep came in fragments. Jim's head against the window, breath fogging the plastic. Eleanor upright, because reclining meant negotiating with the passenger behind her, and she was too tired for negotiation. Dreams blurred into the engine noise, images of Vivian at their wedding, severe and elegant in navy blue, pressing an envelope into Jim's hand. Build something beautiful. Had she known even then? Had she looked at two kids barely old enough to vote and seen something worth saving Denver at 3:47 a.m.? 90-minute layover in an airport that felt like a shopping mall designed by people who'd never needed to sleep on benches. They found seats near their next gate. Jim closed his eyes. Eleanor watched janitors clean floors that would be dirty again in hours, watched security patrol with hands near weapons, watched the machinery of constant motion that defined American infrastructure. Boston at 9:23 a.m. Eastern Time. 6:23. Their bodies insisted, Oregon refusing to let go. Baggage claim produced their single duffel within 15 minutes. The Greyhound terminal was adjacent efficiency born from decades of travelers too poor for rental cars. Tickets to Bar Harbor cost $45 each. The bus left at 10:30, 4 hours northeast through Massachusetts and New Hampshire and into Maine through towns that looked like postcards until you noticed the closed storefronts and for sale signs. Poverty was universal. Geography just changed the scenery. Bar Harbor at 2:47 p.m., tourist town built around Acadia National Park. Summer crowds thinning as August slid toward September. Restaurants with outdoor seating, art galleries, shops selling lighthouse sculptures and lobster-themed kitsch. Everything clean and maintained and designed for people with disposable income. The taxi stand sat near the bus terminal. 3 cars waiting. Jim approached the first, a Camry with 200,000 miles showing wear around the door handles. The driver, 60s local accent thick enough to place him as Maine-born, glanced at Jim's duffel. Jim pulled out the letter, pointed to the address. 47 Lighthouse Road, Cold Harbor. The driver's expression shifted, something between surprise and pity. $60. Jim paid in 20s and 10s, counted out carefully. The driver took the money, gestured them into the back seat. They drove northeast out of Bar Harbor. Tourism gave way to working Maine within 5 miles. Houses that needed paint, boats on trailers missing wheels, the ocean visible in flashes between trees, gray-blue water under overcast sky that threatened rain. 23 miles took 40 minutes on roads that twisted around inlets and through forest. The driver slowed as they entered Cold Harbor, if entering was the right word for arriving somewhere that barely qualified as a town. Population 347 according to the faded sign, 1 Main Street. Cold Harbor general store windows advertising bait and groceries. A church with white clapboard siding. Post office the size of a garden shed. Fishing boats pulled up on shore, lobster traps stacked in yards. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. The driver turned onto Lighthouse Road, pavement degraded to gravel within half a mile. Trees pressed close on both sides, pine and oak, and something with leaves turning early red. Ocean smell stronger here. Salt and seaweed and the particular decay of tidal ecosystems. Houses scattered along the road. Small capes and cottages, most maintained, some clearly summer rentals sitting empty until next June. Then nothing. Just road and forest and the sound of gravel under tires. The taxi slowed. Stopped. 47 Lighthouse Road sat at the end of the gravel drive like something from a photograph left in sunlight, too long, faded, ghostly, more memory than structure. Victorian mansion, 1894, according to the property records Jim had memorized. 3 stories of weathered wood that might have been painted navy once, but time had bleached to silvery gray. Turrets at the corners. Widows walk along the roofline. Wraparound porch with posts carved in patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when labor was cheap and time was abundant. Windows shuttered or broken. Yard consumed by vegetation, wild roses growing 6 feet tall, poison ivy thick as rope climbing the first-floor walls, honeysuckle choking what might have been ornamental shrubs. A sign barely visible through the greenery, private property, no trespassing, Morrison Estate. The driver cleared his throat. His voice carried genuine concern. Jim paid him, $60 counted out in bills. The driver hesitated like he wanted to say something else, then just nodded and drove away. Gravel crunching, engine fading, silence settling in layers. Eleanor stood on the overgrown drive holding their single duffel, staring at the house that was supposedly theirs, that Vivian had lived in alone for 70 years, that they'd gambled everything to reach. It looked like it would collapse if they breathed too hard. Jim pulled the key from his pocket. Heavy, iron, old-fashioned, the kind that required actual metalwork instead of mass production. The envelope from the lawyers had contained just this one key for the front door. No instructions, no explanations. They approached slowly, testing porch boards before putting full weight down. Wood creaked but held, solid underneath the decay. Good bones, as Eleanor's father used to say about houses worth saving. The door was oak, carved with patterns that time had softened but not erased. Jim fit the key into the lock. It stuck. Rust and disuse making resistance. He worked it carefully, patient the way engineers are patient with mechanical problems that have solutions if you don't force them. The lock clicked. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed. Smell hit them first. Mildew, dust, salt air that had been seeping through cracks for decades. The particular staleness of spaces that haven't been opened since someone died. Foyer stretched before them. Grand staircase curving up to the second floor. Chandelier overhead thick with cobwebs and dust. Floor checkered black and white marble, cracked but intact. Rooms branching off on either side. Parlor to the left, dining room to the right, hallway leading back toward what was probably the kitchen. Everything covered in sheets. White fabric ghosting over furniture. Dust coating every surface thick enough to show footprints if anyone had walked here recently. They hadn't. The dust was undisturbed going back months. Years, probably. Jim stepped inside. Floorboards creaked under his weight but held solid. He moved methodically, the engineer examining structure. Checked walls for water damage, ceiling for sag, foundation visible through the gaps where trim had separated. His assessment came out quiet, clinical, mostly sound. Needed work, roof repairs, electrical updates, probably full plumbing replacement, $80,000 in renovations to make it livable. Maybe more, depending on what they found behind walls. They had $1,400 left. Not enough to turn on utilities, not enough for basic supplies, certainly not enough for $80,000 in repairs. Eleanor walked through the ground floor, pulled sheets off furniture in the parlor. Victorian pieces, ornate, probably valuable to collectors if they could find any. Paintings on walls so covered in grime their subjects were invisible. Books lining built-in shelves, leather bindings cracked with age. The kitchen still had a working hand pump at the sink. Jim tested it. Took 20 pumps before water came rusty at first, then clearing. The stove was oil-burning, original to the house. Refrigerator from the 1950s unplugged and empty. No electricity, no gas, no heat. The oil tank in the basement was empty. Jim checked, found the gauge reading 0. 200 gallons would cost $800. They couldn't afford it. Night was coming. 6 p.m. by the time they'd explored the ground floor. August in Maine meant dark by 8. They had candles in their bag, sleeping bags. The granola bars and bottled water they'd bought at the Greyhound station in Boston. This was survival now. Not comfort, not even basic safety. Just staying alive long enough to figure out what Vivian had actually left them. Jim found candles in the kitchen pantry. Vivian stocked dozens of white tapers in boxes, matches that still struck. Eleanor located the cleanest room, which turned out to be the library on the first floor. Books, floor-to-ceiling leather chairs that might have been beautiful, once a desk near the window facing the ocean, half a mile away through the trees. They set up camp. Sleeping bags on the floor. Candles on the desk. Window cracked for air because the house smelled like a tomb, and they needed something fresh, even if it meant letting in the cold. Temperature dropped as night fell. 45 degrees by 8 p.m. They wore every piece of clothing from their duffel. Huddled in sleeping bags pushed together. Body heat the only warmth available. The house made sounds. Old structures settling. Wind finding gaps in siding. Something mice probably moving in the walls. Every creak could have been wood rotting or floors collapsing or the whole edifice deciding that tonight was the night it gave up and folded in on itself. Jim's breathing evened out around 9, exhaustion finally overwhelming discomfort. Eleanor lay awake listening to the symphony of decay and wondering if they'd made the worst decision of their lives. Morning came with fog, thick enough that Eleanor couldn't see the driveway from the front porch. 6 a.m. and 43 degrees. Her breath visible, joints aching from sleeping on hardwood despite the sleeping bag padding. Jim woke coughing, the dry cough that had worried Eleanor since the cancer residual damage the doctors said nothing to concern yourself with. Easy to say when you weren't the one listening to it in the middle of the night. They needed supplies, food, water that wasn't pumped from a well they hadn't tested, information about what this property was worth and whether claiming it would solve anything or just trap them in Maine with no money and no way home. The walk into town took 90 minutes, 1.2 miles according to Jim's phone GPS before the battery died. Gravel road to main road to Cold Harbor's single street. Cold Harbor General Store sat at the town's center like it had probably sat for a century. Wooden building, green trim windows, advertising fresh lobster and night crawlers. Bell jangled when Eleanor pushed the door open. Inside narrow aisles, limited selection prices 20% higher than Portland because shipping to the coast of Maine cost money and small towns couldn't negotiate bulk rates. A woman behind the counter, late 60s gray hair, pulled back watching them with the frank assessment rural people apply to strangers. Eleanor grabbed what they could afford. Bottled water, bread, peanut butter, granola bars, matches, candles, more candles because night came every day and they had no electricity. Total $37.63. The woman rang them up slowly, studying them. Her voice was pure Maine vowels, flattened R's barely present. Jim pulled out the cash, handed over 2 20s. The woman, her name tag read, Connie, made change, but her eyes stayed on them. Eleanor felt her face warm, the humiliation of being local gossip before they'd been in town 24 hours. Small towns ran on information. Their arrival would be discussed at the post office, the church, over dinner, in every house within 5 miles. Connie leaned against the counter, her expression shifting from curiosity to something almost kind. Stories tumbled out. Crazy Vivian, who'd lived alone in that big house for 70 years, never married, never had visitors, used to be an artist or something, came to town maybe once a month for supplies, rich but weird, family money from somewhere, Boston people said, shipping fortune or something like that. She'd died in April, 99 years old, found by the postman when mail piled up for 2 weeks, died in her sleep peaceful, which was more than most people got. The house had been locked up since. Lawyers from Bar Harbor had come handled the estate. Local folks figured it would go to some historical society. Nobody thought actual family would show up. Connie studied them with frank assessment. Eleanor felt the judgment, the calculation happening behind Connie's eyes. 2 elderly people in worn clothes claiming a mansion everyone knew was falling apart. Either desperate or delusional. Probably both. They walked back to the house carrying plastic bags. The fog had burned off, revealing Cold Harbor in full daylight. Boats in the harbor, lobster traps everywhere, houses that looked like they'd weathered generations of storms and would weather generations more. The Morrison mansion looked worse in sunlight, paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked, vegetation that needed serious cutting back before it pulled the whole structure down. But inside in the library, with light coming through dirty windows, Eleanor started finding Vivian. Photo albums in the built-in shelves, leather-bound heavy filled with black and white photographs that told a story across decades. Vivian as a young woman, 1920s maybe. Elegant, severe even then. Photographs from Boston brownstones in the background streets Eleanor didn't recognize. A man who might have been her father, stern, formally dressed. A woman, possibly her mother, smile uncertain. More photos from Paris, 1940s based on the cars and clothing. Vivian at sidewalk cafes, standing in front of galleries, always alone or with people whose faces suggested casual acquaintance rather than intimacy. One photograph stood out. Vivian with another woman, both young, maybe mid-20s, arms linked, smiling at each other instead of the camera. Intimacy clear even across 70 years and faded emulsion. On the back handwritten Helen Paris, 1947. The last photo showed this house. Vivian older, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, always alone, standing on the porch, in the library, by the ocean. growing old in solitude. Why Eleanor kept returning to that question. Why live alone for 70 years in a house this size? What was Vivian protecting? What had been valuable enough to justify complete isolation? Jim was examining the structure systematically, checking every room for soundness, taking notes on his phone while the battery lasted. His assessment grew more detailed as he worked. Foundation solid, walls intact despite cosmetic damage, roof needed work but wasn't actively leaking. Electrical panel outdated, probably early 1900s, would need complete replacement to meet modern code. Plumbing mostly functional though corroded. Estimates still $80,000 to make livable. But the bones were magnificent. Whoever built this house had built it to last. Eleanor found the journals Saturday evening, 12 leather-bound volumes on a shelf behind Vivian's desk, each locked with a small brass mechanism. She tried to open the first. The lock held. They needed help, not just with the journals, with everything. Two elderly people alone in a house without utilities 3,000 miles from anyone who might care if they lived or died. The mathematics of survival were brutal. Sunday morning, Eleanor walked back to town. Jim stayed behind, too exhausted for another 3-mile round trip. She bought coffee at the general store, $3 for a cup that was probably yesterday's reheated, sat on the bench outside. A young woman sat at the other end, 24, maybe 25, purple streaks in brown hair, pride pin on her backpack, face carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from running out of options. Eleanor recognized it because she'd been seeing the same exhaustion in mirrors for months. The girl was crying, not dramatically, just tears sliding down her face while she stared at nothing. The girl looked up, wiped her eyes hastily, forced a smile that didn't reach anywhere near genuine. Eleanor sat down anyway, left space between them but stayed present. The way she'd learned to do with scared second graders, just being there until they felt safe enough to talk. The girl's defenses crumbled, words spilled out in a rush. Architecture student, University of Maine. 3 months ago she'd told her parents the truth about who she was. Lesbian. Had hoped for some version of acceptance, instead got scripture and shouting and a door slammed so hard the frame cracked. Disowned. That was the word her father had used. You're choosing sin over family. Don't come back. She'd been sleeping in her car, working 3 jobs, trying to finish her degree online. But Cold Harbor didn't have jobs. She'd come here because it was cheap and quiet. Had been about to call her parents, beg them to let her come home, promise to change, lie about who she was just to have somewhere safe. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, rage at parents who would choose doctrine over their own child. Recognition because she understood what it meant to be thrown away by people who were supposed to love you. The words came out before Eleanor had fully thought them through. The girl stared. Her voice cracked. Because 52 years ago, someone had given Eleanor a chance. A teacher who'd seen something worth nurturing, who'd written recommendation letters and helped with scholarship applications and believed in a girl from a working-class family who thought college was for other people. Eleanor had become a teacher because of that kindness, had spent 35 years trying to pay it forward. This wasn't about practicality. They could barely survive themselves. Adding another person meant stretching resources that were already failing. But survival wasn't the only thing that mattered. Not anymore. The girl's name was Sloane Hutchins, 24. Architecture degree 90% complete before the money ran out. Specialized in historic preservation because she loved old buildings, loved understanding how structures were made, loved the detective work of figuring out how people in the past had solved problems with limited tools and unlimited patience. She moved into the Morrison house Sunday afternoon. Brought nothing but a backpack, a laptop, and a portfolio of architectural drawings that showed genuine talent. Jim had been skeptical until Sloane looked at his hand-drawn floor plan and immediately started sketching proper elevations. Her hands moved with confidence. Architect's hands. She identified load-bearing walls, original features, later additions, pointed out where the structure was strong and where intervention would be needed. Impressed, Jim showed her the worst damage. Water stains on the 3rd floor. Sloane climbed up, examined the turret room. Measured with a tape measure she pulled from her backpack. Her assessment was more hopeful than Jim's. Bones magnificent. Water damage fixable. This house had been built by craftsmen. The kind of construction you couldn't find anymore because labor that careful cost money modern builders wouldn't pay. She could help. If they wanted. If they'd let someone they'd met 8 hours ago become part of this. Eleanor thought about her children. Garrett, who hadn't called in 31 months. Patricia, who'd blocked them on Facebook. Ben, who sent guilty money and guiltier excuses. Then looked at this girl who'd been thrown away by people who'd raised her, who was sleeping in her car because honesty had cost her everything. Family wasn't who shared your blood. Family was who showed up when showing up mattered. Sunday evening in the library, candles burning, the three of them sitting around Vivian's desk. Eleanor showed Sloane the locked journals, 12 volumes, 1952 through 2023. Vivian's entire life in Maine contained in leather and brass. Sloane examined the lock on the first volume. Small mechanism, old but well made. She pulled a bobby pin from her hair, straightened it, used it like a pick while Eleanor and Jim watched. Patient work, careful manipulation of internal mechanisms that had been designed to keep secrets. The lock clicked open. Eleanor lifted the cover carefully. The first page had an inscription in elegant handwriting. Journal of Vivian Whitmore Morrison. Trading Post, Riverside Settlement. Year of our Lord, 1952. Number. Wait. Eleanor read again. Not Trading Post. The words were different. Private Record, Cold Harbor, Maine. January 1st, 1952. The first entry began. The collection arrives tomorrow from Paris. Father would be furious if he knew I smuggled it out. But he's gone now, and Mother never understood. This house will keep my secrets. The world isn't ready for what I've saved. Perhaps it never will be. But someday someone will find this, someone worthy, and they'll understand what I preserved. Silence held the library. Candles flickered. Outside wind moved through trees and ocean waves crashed against rocks half a mile away. Collection. Smuggled. Secrets. Jim's voice came out carefully controlled. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she turned to the next entry. January 2nd, 1952. Vivian describing crates arriving, unpacking them alone in the middle of the night, hiding them in a room she'd prepared. January 10th. Inventory list. 37 paintings, 12 works on paper, 8 sculptures, names that Eleanor recognized even without art history background: Monet, Renoir, Cassatt, Degas, Winslow Homer, John Singer Sargent, Masters, American and French, Impressionists and Realists. Work worth Eleanor couldn't even estimate. Millions, tens of millions, hidden in this house for 70 years. Sloane opened the second journal. Eleanor the third, Jim the fourth. They read aloud by candlelight, assembling Vivian's story from fragments scattered across decades. Born 1923, wealthy Boston family, Morrison shipping fortune, father who collected art with the ruthlessness of empire building, mother who died when Vivian was 12, artistic herself, rebellious, sent to Sarah Lawrence in the 40s to be refined into appropriate Boston society. Instead, fell in love with another woman. Helen. The photograph from the album Helen Paris 1947 suddenly making complete sense. Father found out. Scandal couldn't be tolerated. Sent Vivian to Paris supposedly to study, actually to separate her from Helen, to cure her of what her father considered moral failing. 1945 through 50. Post-war Paris. Vivian worked in galleries, met Jewish collectors who'd hidden art from the Nazis, helped smuggle paintings to safety, started acquiring pieces herself, legal purchases but made secretly, building a collection her father's family would have sold without hesitation. Father died 1950. Fortune divided among male cousins. Vivian got the Cold Harbor house considered worthless property appropriate for the disappointing daughter who'd failed to marry appropriately. 1952. Vivian smuggled her collection from Paris, hid it here, told no one. Lived alone for 70 years protecting what she'd saved from a family that wouldn't understand its value. Helen had died in 2001, 20 years ago. Vivian had outlived everyone she'd loved. The final journal ended March 15, 2023. 1 month before she died, the handwriting shakier but still elegant. I'm 99 years old. Helen died in 2001. I've outlived everyone I loved. The collection remains hidden. I've left the house to James Morrison. My nephew's grandson met him twice. Seemed kind. If he finds this, I hope he understands art belongs to people who cherish it, not people who monetize it. Do good with what I've saved. V.M. Dawn was breaking. Monday, August 21st. They'd read all night. 12 journals. 70 years of isolation distilled into leather-bound volumes that told a story of love and loss and dedication to beauty that the world had tried to destroy. Sloane's voice carried the wonder of someone who'd just glimpsed something impossible. Eleanor thought about that question. Vivian had been specific, hidden. Not in the basement where dampness would destroy canvas. Not in the attic where heat would crack paint. Somewhere climate-controlled. Somewhere secret. Sloane stood, pulled out the floor plans she'd been sketching, studied them with architectural precision. The turret room, 3rd floor, corner position. When she'd measured it yesterday, something had bothered her. The exterior dimensions didn't match the interior space. They climbed to the 3rd floor, morning light coming through dirty windows. The turret room was 12 by 12 feet. Round, windows facing the ocean, empty except for a wardrobe against one wall. Sloane measured again. Exterior circumference, interior circumference, 4 feet missing, hidden behind false walls. Jim examined every surface, pushed on walls, pulled on trim, found nothing. Sloane approached the wardrobe. Ornate piece, probably valuable itself. She opened it, empty inside. But when she knocked on the back panel, the sound was wrong. Hollow. The wardrobe had no back. Behind it, set into the wall, a metal door, combination lock, 5 digits. They stared at it, at the threshold between poverty and possibility, between everything they'd gambled on being worthless and everything Vivian had promised being real. Eleanor thought about the journals. Dates. Vivian had mentioned repeatedly. March 15th, her birthday. March 15th, 1923, the day she'd been born, the day she'd written her final journal entry, her voice steady even though her hands shook. Jim tried the combination. 3, 1, 5, 2, 3. Metal tumblers clicked. Once, twice, 3 times. The lock opened with a sound like bones settling. Jim pulled the door. It swung inward. Darkness beyond. He found a light switch. Flipped it. Nothing happened, no electricity. But when he stepped inside, motion triggered something. Backup generator. Lights flickered on. Climate-controlled room. 12 by 12 feet. Cedar-lined. Temperature gauge showing 65 degrees exactly, maintained by systems that had run for 70 years on automatic backup. Paintings on the walls, each wrapped in acid-free cloth. Sculptures on pedestals. Filing cabinet against one wall. Sloane moved first. Unwrapped the nearest painting with reverent care. Canvas revealed itself. Water lilies, blue and green and purple. Brushstrokes thick and immediate. Signature in the corner barely visible but unmistakable, Claude Monet. 1919. Eleanor found the filing cabinet, opened it. Provenance documents, appraisal records, last updated 2010. She read aloud, voice shaking. Monet Water Lilies Series 1919. 2010 appraisal $22 million. Jim unwrapped the second painting. Mother and child, tender, intimate. Signature Mary Cassatt, 1890. Documents, $8 million. Third painting. Winslow Homer, The Gulf Stream Study, 1899. $12 million. Sloane's architectural training gave way to something close to worship, her voice barely audible. Eleanor counted documents. 37 paintings, 12 works on paper, 8 sculptures, each with provenance, each with appraisal. Total assessed value, 2010, $187 million. 13 years of inflation. Art market growth. Conservative estimate of current value, 240 to 260 million. They stood in a room worth $250 million. 3 people who'd arrived in Maine with less than $1,500, who'd gambled everything on faith that an elderly woman they'd met twice had left them something worth more than abandonment. Eleanor sat down on the cedar floor, not gracefully, just her legs giving out under the weight of understanding what this meant. Jim leaned against the wall, his face impossible to read. Sloane moved through the space like someone in a museum, examining each piece, touching nothing, just bearing witness to beauty that had been hidden for 7 decades. The silence stretched until Eleanor broke it. Her voice came out strange, not quite laughter, not quite tears. They'd come to Maine to escape dying alone in nursing homes 18 miles apart, had spent their last money on one-way tickets to claim an inheritance everyone said was worthless. Instead, they'd found $250 million in art. Instead, they'd found proof that faith mattered more than mathematics. Instead, they'd found family in a girl they'd met 3 days ago who understood what it meant to be thrown away and still believe in second chances. Vivian's final words echoed, "Do good with what I've saved. Not get rich. Not retire comfortably. Do good." The sun rose fully over Cold Harbor. Light spilled through the turret windows into the secret room where Vivian had protected beauty from people who would have destroyed it or sold it or locked it away where no one could see. Eleanor thought about her children. About Garrett, who'd sent flowers instead of visiting. About Patricia, who'd blocked them on Facebook. About 31 months of silence from people who'd shared her blood but not her values. Then looked at Jim, her partner for 52 years, who'd never given up. Looked at Sloan, this stranger who'd become family in the space between Saturday afternoon and Monday morning. Vivian had left them more than money. She'd left them purpose. A chance to do with wealth what Vivian herself had done: preserve it. Protect it. Use it for something beyond accumulation. But first they needed help. Legal help. Expert help. Protection from whatever would come next when the world learned that 2 elderly people worth $843 last Tuesday were now worth $245 million. And when that happened, when the news spread, Eleanor knew exactly who would show up. Not because they cared, because there was money involved. Her children would come. After 31 months of silence, after abandoning them to homelessness and separation, after every cruelty and every broken promise, Garrett and Patricia would show up. Not to apologize, to claim what they'd never earned, to take what they'd never deserved. Eleanor stood up slowly, joints protesting, age making itself known, but her voice came out harder than it had in years. For the first time since diagnosis and debt and losing everything, Eleanor Morrison felt like more than a victim of circumstance. She felt dangerous. Sloan made the call Monday afternoon. Her phone had better signal than Jim's ancient flip phone, and she knew someone who could help. Harrison Whitmore, retired appraiser from Christie's, lived in Bar Harbor, 23 miles south. Also in this mattered in ways Eleanor was only beginning to understand, a distant cousin of Vivian's. Different branch of the Whitmore family tree. They'd never met, but he'd heard stories about Cousin Vivian, the black sheep. Brilliant woman who'd chosen art over respectability. He arrived Tuesday morning in a Volvo older than Sloan. 78, stooped but sharp-eyed, carrying equipment in cases that looked like they'd survived decades of travel. White hair thinning, hands that trembled slightly until they touched art, then steadied with professional certainty. Harrison Whitmore had spent 35 years authenticating paintings for people rich enough that value was measured in millions and reputation mattered more than money. He'd retired 3 years ago when his wife Elizabeth died and discovered that retirement meant loneliness in a house too large for one person. Sloan had met him during an architecture project researching historic Bar Harbor mansions. They'd stayed in touch. He'd been kind when her parents threw her out, offered help she'd been too proud to accept. Now he stood in the secret room staring at artwork he'd only seen in catalogs and museum collections. His voice carried the reverence of someone encountering the sacred. 4 hours of examination followed. Harrison used a jeweler's loupe to study signatures. Cross-referenced provenance documents against records he accessed through databases maintained by auction houses and museums, photographed each piece from multiple angles, made notes in handwriting so precise it looked typeset. His verdict came with the weight of professional reputation staked on accuracy. Everything authentic, provenance impeccable. Vivian had documented each acquisition with the thoroughness of someone who understood that proof of ownership mattered as much as possession. Bills of sale from Paris galleries, export permits, customs declarations, a paper trail that would satisfy any court or museum or insurance company. The 2010 appraisals were conservative. Art markets had risen substantially in 13 years. Major Impressionist works that sold for $20 million in 2010 brought $40 million now. American masters had tripled in value as museums competed to repatriate cultural heritage. Harrison's estimate came with careful caveats about market fluctuations and auction variables, but his numbers were precise. Monet collection 4 pieces, $98 million. Cassatt collection 6 pieces, $47 million. Homer and Sargent 8 pieces, $52 million. French Impressionists Miscellaneous 19 pieces, 38 million. Sculptures and works on paper 10 million. Total current fair market value $245 million. The house itself, Victorian mansion on 4 acres of Maine coastline, added another $18 million in architectural value once restored. Combined estate $263 million. Numbers that large stopped meaning anything. Eleanor couldn't conceptualize the difference between 10 million and 200 million beyond abstract understanding that both represented more money than she'd see in a dozen lifetimes. What she understood was consequence. Wealth this substantial created obligations, legal obligations, tax obligations, security obligations, the infrastructure required to protect and manage assets worth more than some small nation's GDP. Harrison's voice carried concern beyond professional interest. Lawyers, security, insurance. Each word represented systems Eleanor and Jim couldn't navigate alone. Systems designed for people born into wealth who understood its mechanisms, not for two elderly people who'd arrived in Maine with $1,400 and desperation. Harrison hesitated, something in his expression softening. He was offering more than professional services, offering himself, his expertise, his connections, his resources. And something else, companionship. The recognition of someone else who was lonely, who needed purpose, who saw in this impossible situation a chance to matter again. Sloane accepted before Eleanor could, her voice carrying certainty. Found family growing. First Sloane, now Harrison. People who showed up not because biology demanded it, but because choice allowed it. Jim's phone rang Tuesday at 4 p.m. The sound jarring in the library where they'd been cataloging Vivian's book collection first editions, some valuable, most just cherished by a woman who'd lived alone with literature for company. Connie Porter from the general store. Her voice apologetic but determined. Small towns operated on gossip the way cities ran on commerce. Information currency. Connie's sister in Portland knew their old neighbor from Maple Drive. Chain of connection that had carried news 3,000 miles in 3 days. Elderly couple Morrison inherited big house in Maine. Someone had called Garrett. Multiple someones probably. The story spreading until it reached Manhattan legal circles where a man named Garrett Morrison would hear that his parents, the ones he hadn't contacted in 31 months, had come into property worth discussing. Jim thanked Connie, ended the call, his face unreadable in the way Eleanor recognized as containing significant emotion under rigid control. Garrett would come. Not because he cared, because there was money involved, potential money, inherited wealth that would be easier to claim than earn. And he'd bring lawyers, bring arguments about competency and decision-making capacity and whatever legal framework allowed adult children to seize control of elderly parents' assets under the guise of protection. Eleanor felt rage building, the kind that came from 31 months of abandonment crystallizing into single-focused understanding. Her son viewed her as an asset to be managed, not a person deserving respect. Harrison made calls Tuesday evening. Reached out to colleagues in the legal profession who specialized in estate law and elder protection. One name came back repeatedly. Cordelia Ashford, Bar Harbor attorney, 52, solo practitioner for 28 years. Reputation for defending vulnerable clients from predatory family members. She arrived Wednesday morning before Garrett did. Drove from Bar Harbor in a Subaru with Maine plates and bumper stickers supporting causes Eleanor approved of: literacy programs, environmental protection, reproductive rights. Cordelia Ashford was tall, severe, dressed in professional clothes that had been expensive once and were now maintained rather than replaced. Her handshake was firm. Her eyes assessed Eleanor and Jim with the same clinical precision Harrison had applied to paintings. She listened while they explained. The medical debt, the homelessness, 31 months of silence, the inheritance, the $250 million collection, the children who would arrive any moment seeking control. Cordelia's questions were direct. Had they been diagnosed with dementia or cognitive impairment? No. Were they taking medications that affected judgment? Standard prescriptions for blood pressure and cholesterol? Nothing psychoactive. Could they demonstrate understanding of complex financial decisions? Eleanor walked her through the spreadsheet Jim had created detailing the collection's value, provenance, and legal status, comprehensive enough to impress someone who'd spent 3 decades reviewing estate documents. Cordelia's assessment was blunt. The conservatorship threat was theater. Garrett would file claiming his parents were incapacitated by age and poverty, would argue that competent people don't end up homeless, would use their circumstances as evidence of impairment rather than consequence of medical debt. Courts took these petitions seriously. Elder abuse was real. Families did exploit vulnerable relatives. But this wasn't that. This was reverse exploitation, adult children attempting to seize assets from parents who'd sacrificed everything for them. Cordelia could fight it, would fight it. Her fee structure was unusual, 3% of estate value if they prevailed, nothing if they lost. Garrett would pay court costs and opposing legal fees when not if his petition failed. She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd won battles like this before. Eleanor liked her immediately, liked the steel underneath professional courtesy, liked that Cordelia looked at a 72-year-old woman and saw someone worth defending rather than someone needing protection from themselves. The black Mercedes arrived Wednesday at 10 a.m. Rental car expensive model driver visible through tinted windows. It pulled into the overgrown drive and stopped where the taxi had stopped 6 days ago. 3 people emerged. Garrett first, 48 years old, tall like his father had been at that age. Suit that cost more than Eleanor's monthly Social Security check. Briefcase. Lawyer posture, shoulders back. Chin elevated, expression arranged into professional concern. Patricia followed. 46. Thinner than Eleanor remembered. Expensive highlights in hair that had been brown like Eleanor's but was now carefully maintained blonde. Designer jeans. Uncomfortable shoes. Following Garrett like she'd been following him since childhood, the younger sister who'd learned early that agreement was easier than independence. Benjamin came last. 42, rumpled compared to his siblings, slacks that needed pressing, shirt with a small stain near the collar, teacher clothes, teacher salary evident in every detail that contrasted with Garrett's obvious wealth. His face carried guilt that was almost physical, shoulders hunched, eyes unable to meet anyone directly. They approached the house, Garrett leading. He didn't knock, just opened the door unlocked because Eleanor had stopped seeing the point of locks when you owned a house but couldn't afford to defend it, and walked in like he had every right. His voice carried through the foyer. Not warm, not apologetic, just stating facts. Eleanor and Jim were in the library, Sloan and Harrison upstairs giving them space. Cordelia standing to one side, observer and witness, legal firepower held in reserve. The 3 Morrison children entered, stopped when they saw their parents. Patricia's face flickered with something that might have been shame before smoothing into neutrality. Ben looked like he might cry or run, couldn't decide which. Garrett just assessed the room with the efficiency of someone cataloging assets. His opening move was aggressive, straight to the legal threat without preamble. Eleanor felt Jim tense beside her, felt her own blood pressure rising. 31 months of silence, and Garrett's first words were about their decision-making capacity. Patricia pulled out notes Garrett had obviously prepared for her. Read mechanically about their ages, their poverty, living without utilities, making decisions that suggested impairment. Eleanor's voice came out harder than she'd intended, pure steel underneath the words. Garrett continued like she hadn't spoken, explaining conservatorship, legal guardianship, how they'd moved to assisted living. He had the grace not to mention separate facilities, but Eleanor heard the implication, and the children would manage assets, sell the property, handle the collection properly. The collection he hadn't known existed until gossip reached Manhattan, the property he hadn't cared about when it was just his parents, homeless and desperate. Eleanor stood. Not gracefully, 72-year-old knees protested, but with enough force to make Garrett pause. She thought about every piano recital she'd attended, every science fair project she'd helped build, every college tuition check she'd written. 50 years of love reduced to abandonment the moment that love became inconvenient. Her voice shook, but not with weakness, with rage that had been building for 31 months. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere Eleanor had been protecting because examining it hurt too much. But hurt didn't matter anymore. Truth was the only thing that mattered. She kept going, every word landing like judgment. Patricia tried to speak, the same weak justification she'd probably been telling herself for 31 months. Eleanor turned on her. No mercy left. Patricia went silent, eyes down, shame visible now, undeniable, but 31 months too late to matter. Eleanor shifted to Garrett, the primary villain, the architect of abandonment who'd taught his sister that parents were disposable when inconvenient. She let the silence hold, let them absorb the weight of their choices reflected back, then delivered the conclusion that had been building since they'd walked through the door. Garrett's face went red, professional composure cracking. He started to respond, threats about filing petitions, about proving incapacity, about legal consequences. Harrison Whitmore stepped into the room, interrupted with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades in environments where money talked and everything else whispered. Garrett turned, sizing up this stranger who dared interrupt. Harrison's response was gentle, almost kind, which made it more devastating. The implication was clear. Harrison Whitmore, distant Whitmore cousin, former Christie's senior appraiser, man of evident means, had chosen Eleanor and Jim after 3 days of knowing them, had offered support and resources and himself, while their own children had offered 31 months of silence. Garrett stormed out, Mercedes engine starting with expensive precision, gravel spraying as he accelerated away. Patricia followed, crying now, but still following, still choosing Garrett over her own conscience. Ben remained, standing in the library doorway looking wrecked. His voice broke. Eleanor wanted to forgive him, wanted to tell him it was okay, that she understood being caught between siblings and parents, that weakness wasn't malice, but forgiveness required accountability, required change, required more than apologies. Her voice was softer but still firm. Ben nodded, tears on his face. But he left, following his siblings because following was what Ben had always done. Silence filled the library after they'd gone. Heavy silence. The kind that follows confrontation when everyone's adrenaline is still too high for rational thought. Jim spoke first, his voice quiet but carrying something Eleanor recognized as pride. She'd spent 50 years being accommodating, being the good wife, the good mother, the good teacher who never made waves, being the person everyone could count on to smooth over conflicts and find compromises and keep peace. Peace hadn't protected her. Peace hadn't kept her children from abandoning her. Peace was what you chose when you had power to spare. She had no power to spare, just dignity. And dignity required defending. Cordelia's voice carried professional satisfaction. Garrett filed the conservatorship petition Friday morning. Cumberland County Superior Court. Emergency hearing requested. Claims that Eleanor and James Morrison, ages 72 and 74, showed impaired judgment evidenced by recent homelessness, living without utilities, and susceptibility to undue influence from strangers, met days ago. Requested immediate appointment of guardian himself, with authority to manage all assets including recently inherited property. The hearing was set for Friday, September 1st, 6 days away. Cordelia prepared like she was going to war. Arranged for Dr. Francis Aldridge, geriatric psychiatrist from Portland, to conduct cognitive assessments. Obtained medical records showing no dementia, no psychoactive medications, no conditions affecting judgment. Compiled financial documents demonstrating that poverty resulted from medical debt, not poor decisions, that every choice Eleanor and Jim had made was rational response to catastrophic circumstances. She coached Eleanor on testimony, how to speak to judges, how to project competence without arrogance, how to tell their story in ways that highlighted agency rather than victimhood. Thursday afternoon, Cordelia arranged professional appraisal for court purposes. 2 independent experts from Boston, Jennifer Hartley from Sotheby's, Marcus Liu, chief curator of American art at Museum of Fine Arts. Both spent 8 hours examining the collection. Both produced reports confirming Harrison's assessment. Official appraisal for court record. $245 million in artwork, $18 million in architectural value. Combined estate $263 million. Numbers that would be part of public record once filed. Numbers Garrett would see. Numbers that would make him fight harder because the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. Friday, September 1st. Cumberland County Courthouse, 62 miles from Cold Harbor. Cordelia drove Eleanor and Jim in her Subaru. Harrison and Sloan followed in Harrison's Volvo, moral support and potential witnesses. The courthouse was modern, built in the 90s, all glass and steel and accessibility features. Nothing like the courtrooms Eleanor had seen in movies. Just bureaucratic space where lives were decided with the same administrative efficiency as zoning permits. Garrett's lawyer was from Manhattan, partner at Whitestone and Associates. $800 an hour according to research Cordelia had done. Suit that probably cost what Jim used to make in a month. Performance of competence designed to intimidate. He presented their case with polished efficiency. Two elderly people, recently homeless, living in house without utilities, making irrational decisions under influence of strangers. Clear evidence of impairment. Need for protective intervention. Judge Margaret Thornton listened from the bench. 62. Female. Reputation for fairness and low tolerance for bad faith litigation. Her expression gave nothing away. Cordelia called Dr. Aldridge first, geriatric psychiatrist who'd examined Eleanor and Jim 2 days ago. Her testimony was clinical, thorough, devastating to Garrett's case. Mini mental state examination scores 29 out of 30 for both. Perfect cognition. Independent living assessment, fully capable. No evidence of dementia, delirium, or cognitive impairment of any kind. Recent homelessness resulted from medical debt, rational consequence of American healthcare system, not decision-making failure. Garrett's lawyer tried to shake her, questioned whether poverty itself suggested impairment. Dr. Aldridge responded with academic precision, poverty was structural, not psychological. Competent people became poor every day through circumstances beyond their control. Judgment was separate from outcome. Cordelia called Harrison next. He testified about the collection's value, the sophistication required to understand provenance documents, Eleanor's comprehensive grasp of legal and financial implications. Testified that he'd chosen to help them not because they were impaired, but because they were competent people in impossible circumstances who deserved support. Garrett's lawyer attacked the relationship, suggested undue influence. Stranger meeting vulnerable elderly people and immediately offering financial help. Classic exploitation pattern. Harrison's response was quiet, dignified, more cutting than anger. He let the implication hang. 3 days versus 31 months. A stranger versus their own son, who was really exploiting whom Cordelia called Sloan. She testified about meeting Eleanor, being offered housing, watching them make thoughtful decisions about the property. Testified that she'd disclosed her architecture expertise before being invited in. No deception, no manipulation, just honesty that Eleanor had chosen to trust. Then Cordelia called Eleanor. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking to judgment. Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she swore to tell the truth. She'd spent 35 years teaching second graders. Never imagined she'd end up testifying in court against her own son. Cordelia's questions were direct, establishing competence, walking through the medical debt, the foreclosure, the abandonment, building the narrative that everything that had happened to Eleanor and Jim was rational response to irrational circumstances. Then Cordelia asked the question that mattered. Eleanor looked at Garrett sitting with his expensive lawyer, looked at Patricia beside him, eyes down, looked at the judge. She spoke directly, no notes, no rehearsal, just truth that had been building for 31 months. She detailed the silence, the flowers instead of visits, the 8-word text, the blocked Facebook account, the returned birthday card, every specific instance of abandonment laid out like evidence, then shifted to the foundation plan. $233 million donated to help others. Elderly people facing the poverty Eleanor and Jim had survived. Young people like Sloan who'd been thrown away by families that should have protected them. Communities that needed culture and beauty and proof that art belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy. Her voice steadied as she spoke. This wasn't about defending herself. This was about defining what wealth meant when you'd been poor enough to understand its absence. She looked directly at Judge Thornton, woman to woman, elder to elder. The courtroom was silent. Garrett's lawyer stood, started to argue. Judge Thornton raised one hand. Her voice carried absolute authority. She looked at Garrett with expression that could have frozen water. The gavel came down. Final. Absolute. Case dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Ben approached. Garrett and Patricia were already in their rental Mercedes, driving away without looking back. Ben's face was wrecked, red-eyed, guilty. Eleanor wanted to be angry, wanted to maintain the rage that had carried her through testimony. But looking at her youngest son, the one who'd at least tried, who'd sent money he couldn't afford, who'd cried when he should have acted, she felt something softer. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility of forgiveness if he earned it. Jim's hand found Eleanor's, squeezed, their silent language after 52 years. Ben nodded, wiped his eyes, made a promise that would take years to fulfill or break. Eleanor hugged him, first time in 31 months. He felt thinner than she remembered, Smaller. Not the confident boy who'd won second place at the science fair, but a middle-aged man who'd spent years making cowardly choices and was just beginning to understand their cost. But beginning mattered. Beginning was more than Garrett or Patricia had managed. The foundation took shape over the next 2 months, lawyers and accountants and endless paperwork transforming intent into legal structure. Morrison Foundation Incorporated as 501c3 nonprofit. Mission statement written by Eleanor. To preserve beauty, support dignity, and provide second chances to those whom circumstance or family has abandoned. One Monet study sold at auction in October, the least significant piece. $12 million gross, $8 million net after taxes and fees. Enough to pay off medical debt, renovate the house, establish security for Eleanor and Jim's remaining years, and pay Ben's student loans contingent on him proving himself through work with the Foundation's education programs. $5.6 million remained in reserve, invested conservatively. Income sufficient to cover their modest needs indefinitely. The remaining collection, $233 million in assessed value, transferred to the foundation. The house became Morrison Art Museum and Community Center. Renovations began in October. Climate-controlled gallery wing, community space, private quarters for Eleanor and Jim. By December, the house had electricity, plumbing, heat, the first warm shelter they'd had since losing their apartment 5 months ago. Sloan's architecture degree completed online. Harrison moved from Bar Harbor to Cold Harbor, taking up residence in staff housing built behind the main structure. Morrison Art Museum opened May 15, 2024. Free admission, always. 37 paintings, 12 works on paper, 8 sculptures. Vivian's collection finally visible after 70 years of hiding. First-year attendance, 14,300 visitors. Population of Cold Harbor, 347. Ratio of visitors to residents, 41:1. The town transformed by people coming to see beauty they'd never expected to find on the Maine coast. Programs launched throughout 2024. Elder housing assistance, $5 million annually, helping 127 individuals in year 1. Prevented 43 nursing home separations. Paid off $2.3 million in medical debt. Average assistance per case, $39,000. Exactly enough to make the difference between stability and catastrophe. Rainbow Haven opened in Cold Harbor. 12-bed facility for LGBTQ youth ages 16 to 24. Budget $3 million annually. Year 1 housed 34 young people. 0 homelessness among residents. 28 returned to education. Sloan served as peer mentor and facility architect. Arts education programs, $2 million annually. Free after-school programs in 8 Maine towns. Teacher training led by Ben, who'd quit his Portland teaching job to work full-time for the foundation, proving himself slowly. Scholarships, 67 students year 1. By August 2025, exactly 2 years after the certified letter arrived, the foundation had touched 2,201 lives directly. Elder assistance, 283 individuals. LGBTQ youth, 71 housed. Arts education, 1,847 students. Museum visitors, 31,200 in year 2. Cold Harbor transformed. Population grew from 347 to 412. 3 new art galleries. 2 cafes. 1 bookstore. Tourism revenue up $1.8 million annually. Town revitalized by an elderly woman's choice 70 years ago to hide beauty until someone worthy found it. Eleanor Morrison, age 74, taught art history for everyone every Thursday. Free lectures in the museum gallery. Standing room only by week 3. She'd spent 35 years teaching second graders to read, now taught retirees and tourists and locals to see. Jim, age 76, maintained the museum and mentored young people in carpentry. His cancer remained in remission. 3 years clean scans. The 20% survival odds beaten by stubbornness and spite, and the particular determination that came from refusing to die before proving his children wrong about everything. Sloan, 26, served as lead architect. Designed the new wing opening spring 2026. Engaged to her girlfriend, proposed in the museum last December. Still estranged from her parents, but healing with a therapist funded by the foundation she now helped run. Harrison, 80, was chief curator and had the best years of his life after his wife died. Built a found family from strangers who became more real than blood. Spent his days with art he loved and people who valued him for more than expertise. Ben worked. proved himself slowly through action rather than promises. Relationship with his parents rebuilt incrementally, phone calls every week, visits monthly, trust earned in tiny deposits against massive debt. Garrett and Patricia, no contact. 2 years, 1 month, total silence now. 33 months. Eleanor sent Christmas cards anyway, every year. No response. She'd made peace with that. Some relationships ended not with explosion, but with entropy, just drifting until distance made contact impossible. August 15, 2025. Exactly 2 years since the certified letter. Morrison Museum held anniversary celebration. 200 people gathered, half the town's population. Mayor, local press, families who'd been helped by foundation programs. Eleanor and Jim stood on the porch where they'd first arrived 2 years ago, where they'd looked at a mansion that seemed ready to collapse and chosen faith over surrender. Eleanor spoke to the assembled crowd. No script, just truth distilled from 74 years of living. Her voice carried across the lawn. She gestured to the museum behind her, to the community center, to the people gathered who represented lives changed by choices made in desperation. She found Jim's hand, held it the way she'd held it for 54 years now, partnership that had survived poverty and cancer and abandonment and every test that life could devise. Her voice strengthened, speaking not just to the crowd but to anyone anywhere who thought it was too late to change their story. She looked at Sloan standing with her girlfriend, at Harrison beside them, at Ben helping set up chairs for elderly attendees, at the foundation staff and volunteers and the 100 small ways that choosing generosity had rippled outward. She concluded simply, the wisdom earned through suffering and survival. The crowd applauded. Eleanor and Jim walked through the museum together, stopped at Monet's Water Lilies, one of the pieces that hadn't sold, that would never sell, that existed now for everyone instead of collectors. 54 years married, 72 and 76 years old, cancer survivors, poverty survivors, parents of children who'd abandoned them and one who'd found his way back, guardians of beauty that a lonely woman had protected for 7 decades. They'd started with $843.17, gambled it all on faith, found $245 million in something more valuable, purpose, family, proof that wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it to do good. Garrett and Patricia lived in expensive homes in expensive cities with expensive lives that had bought them everything except peace. Eleanor and Jim lived in a Victorian mansion on the Maine coast, surrounded by art and people who'd chosen to love them, doing work that mattered more than money ever could. The mathematics were simple when you measured what actually counted. They'd won.